At the end of the last lecture, I told you that we were getting ready to move from client-side programming to server-side programming. But it turns out there's actually one more topic I want to cover with respect to client-side programming, and that's the JQuery library. JQuery is an incredibly useful library, and it's a really standard library. It's used all over the place. In fact, it's so common that you can't really call yourself a web programmer or a web designer if you don't know some JQuery. And it's almost synonymous with a JavaScript language. If you use JavaScript, you pretty much use jQuery too. So I wanted to give you kind of an introduction to jQuery today. I think you'll find this useful for your project for Lab 3, and I encourage you to use it. I'm only going to go over the basics of jQuery. If you want to learn more, there's a lot of information available on the web. W3 Schools has a section on jQuery, actually several different sections on jQuery. There's a lot more to dive into here. But I hope that you'll treat this as a starting place and then explore from there. So to review a little bit, last week we talked about how to use JavaScript to manipulate the DOM, the document object model. And the advantage of using DOM functions is that they're part of the JavaScript specification. Every web browser has a DOM. It has a tree that it builds, and we can use those same functions to access the elements of the web page. So it's cross-platform. We can use the getElementById function to fetch an element, and it's built into the web browser. We don't have to do anything else in order to be able to use that function. We just have to have JavaScript code. But it's pretty awkward. It's difficult to use. So jQuery is a software library that allows us to manipulate the DOM without doing all of the DOM functions. So it adds a lot of functionality to JavaScript that simplifies designing client-side code. So it's a software library, which means that it's a collection of functions. These are functions written in JavaScript, but they've been written for you. Somebody else wrote them, and they're distributed as a package that you can download and use in your web page. But the nice thing about jQuery is that it's open source. You don't have to pay anybody to use the jQuery library. You can download it and use it. And as long as you give proper credit and you don't try to sell their work as your own, you're free to do what you want with it. In fact, you can not only just use it in your code, but you can actually make changes to it. And if other people like them, you can share your changes and give back to the community, which is a pretty neat thing. So you can get jQuery from their website, jQuery.com. If you go to the download page, you can just click on the link to download it. There's a couple different versions. There's a development version, and then there's a compressed version that loads faster, and which you should use in production web pages. But for this class, please do use the uncompressed development version. On the server, the easiest way to fetch the jQuery library is to use a wget command. And if you first change to the correct directory, cd to public HTML, and then cd to lab 3, you can run this wget command to download the jQuery library directly into your project folder, and then you can use it from your pages. I recommend that you do it this way, because then you don't have to transfer it to your laptop, and then from your laptop to Gandalf, the computer science server. You can just use wget, and it'll be there. Once you've downloaded jQuery, if you want to use it in a web page, you embed it with a script tag, just like you've been embedding your own JavaScript functions, I hope, in Lab 3. You can say script source equals, and then jQuery-3.1.1.js will pull in the latest version of jQuery. So now that we've got jQuery, what can we do with it? Well, the key to using jQuery is the jQuery function. And almost everything you do with jQuery starts with calling the jQuery function. So for example, suppose I have this little snippet of HTML. I have a paragraph, and I've given it the ID bio. And it says, my name is George, and I am a monkey. And then I have a span tag in the class highlight that says curious. And I live with a man in a span tag with class highlight yellow hat. So this is my HTML. I've got my paragraph with ID bio, and 2 span tags in class highlight. So what can I do with this using jQuery? Well, I can write a little bit of JavaScript code. Maybe this would go in a function that I trigger with an onload event. And the first thing I do is I create a variable named text, and I call the jQuery function. And notice I pass into the jQuery function #bio. That's going to actually fetch the paragraph that has ID bio. And now I have the DOM object actually what I have is an array of objects, which includes the DOM object, but we'll pretend for a minute. And I can go to that object and say .style.color gets green, and that will change all the text of that paragraph to green. Excuse me. Then I can make another variable named highlight, and I can use the JQuery function to fetch all of the elements in my page in the highlight class. And notice I just use what looks like a CSS selector, .highlight. And then I can use a for loop to loop through them all and set their color to yellow. So if I run this code, I'll get something that looks like this. So notice my paragraph is in green, but the two words that I put in span tags, curious and yellow, are now colored yellow, which I now realize is very hard to see on a white background on this slide, but it is what it is. So the jQuery function takes a parameter that's usually a CSS selector. So hashtag ID, hashtag bio, dot highlight, dot navbar. And it returns an array of DOM objects that match that CSS selector. So it doesn't just return an object, it returns an array of objects. And remember, an array in JavaScript is an object. That's why I've capitalized the word array here, because an array is actually a JavaScript object that contains several different items. I'm going to get everything that matches that CSS selector. And then I can use the typical JavaScript array access notation to access the elements. The jQuery function is something that you use over and over and over and over. And so instead of having to type out the word jQuery every time, the developers at jQuery have given us a nice little shortcut. If we use a $, that represents the jQuery function. So a $, followed by 2 parentheses is a shortcut for the jQuery function. So I can have the code that I wrote before, instead of saying jQuery and after that hashtag bio, I can say $#bio. Similarly, instead of saying jQuery .highlight, I can say $.highlight. And this is a quick and easy way to access the elements on the web page. So up until now, we've been triggering a lot of our code in response to events like onClick or onLoad. In particular, we've been using the onLoad attribute of the body object, the body element, to trigger a lot of our JavaScript code. But in jQuery, we have an alternative to that. We can use the jQuery function directly to execute code when the page is ready, when the page is done loading. There's a slight difference between this. OnLoad waits until the entire page is loaded, including all of the images. If you use the jQuery function, the $ function, to run code, it'll wait until the entire DOM is in memory, but not necessarily all of the images that go with the DOM. The image objects will be there, but the actual pixels may not have shown up on the screen yet. So that's usually a good thing, because it means our code will run sooner and quicker. We don't have to wait for everything to finish. On the other hand, sometimes you prefer to use onLoad because you want to wait for the images to be done loading. So for example, I could use the $, the jQuery function, the $parens function, to add a function that says page loaded in an alert box when the page is ready. And that looks like this. Notice that the section in green is an anonymous JavaScript function. If I pass a function to the jQuery function, it makes that function my onLoad function, or actually my ready function. When the page is ready, it'll run that function. So any code I put between those curly braces is going to run when the page is ready. So jQuery provides a bunch of helper functions that allow us to manipulate the DOM. And some of them are listed here. The first thing that I can do is change some of the CSS styling of an element. In the example I showed you before, I used .style.color and set it to green. But I had to do some nasty stuff to do that. I had to use the sub-bracket 0 to get the first object that matched. Or I had to use a loop to loop through all of the objects that matched. If I instead use the .css function, I can apply a CSS style change to all of the objects in the page that matched my CSS selector. So for example, I could say $ parentheses, and inside the parentheses I could put, in quote marks, .highlight. And that would match all of the elements of my page in the highlight class. And then I could say .css And for property, I could put color. And for value, I could put yellow. And that would do exactly the same thing I did before, except I didn't have to use a for loop. So this is really convenient. Probably should have given you some example code for that in this slide. Hindsight is 20/20. So the .css function after a jQuery selector will change the CSS property to the value. Another thing that you can do is fetch the text inside an element. And you do that with the .text function. So for example, I could use a selector that gives me all the paragraphs, and I could say .text, and that would return a string containing the text of the paragraph. I can also change the text inside a paragraph using the .text function. I just have to put a parameter inside the parentheses. So I can put the new text inside the parentheses, and that will actually change what's in the paragraph. I can change attributes. I can access attributes by saying .attr and providing a key. The key would be something like href or src, one of those attributes to an HTML tag. And the function will return the value of that attribute. So for example, if I say .adder href on an element, it'll return the link that it links to, the URL. I can also change an attribute with .adder. I just have to give it two parameters. The first parameter is the key, like href or src, and the second parameter is the value. So for example, if I have a button in my page with ID button, I can use the $ function or the jQuery function to fetch the button object. And then I can say .click, which we'll talk about in a minute. That basically responds to a click event, and have it run this function. It'll find an image tag, all image tags in fact in my document, and it'll use the .adder function to change the width of those images to 300 pixels. So when they click the button, all the images in my web page are going to grow or shrink to exactly 300 pixels wide. I can also add and remove things from the DOM. I do that with the after, before, append, and prepend functions. After adds an element to the DOM after the current element. So for example, at the bottom, my first example uses the jQuery function, the $ function, to access the element with ID container. And I use the .after function to add a new element that will appear after the container in my HTML. And what I'm adding is a new paragraph. Notice I can just put the HTML for my element in there, p, some new text, /p, and it will add that HTML to my document after container. Now, it's not changing the file on the server. It's just changing the HTML in your web browser's memory. So it'll add the paragraph some new text, but it won't change it. The next time you load the page, it's not going to have that text there, right, until the JavaScript function runs again. The .before function takes an element and adds it before the current element. So down below, I use the jQuery selector in the second example to find all list item tags, all li tags. And before them, I'm going to add a bold element, document.create element of bold. The append function adds an element to the beginning of the current element. So it puts it inside an element as a child of that element, but it puts it at the end. Prepend does the same thing. It creates a child element, but it puts it at the beginning of the current element. So here, at the very bottom of my slide, I found all the bold tags. And to every single bold tag, I'm appending the HTML code point. So that'll look something like this. The original web page just had the words, this is some sample text, and a list of items that said, dogs have 4 legs, all cats have 4 legs, therefore all cats are dogs, which of course is fallacious, but it's kind of fun. My jQuery code added the paragraph some new text. That's this first example. After the container paragraph, it added the paragraph with some new text in it. And then before every single list item, it put a bold element, and in that bold element, we put the words point. So the word point appears in bold before every list item now. We can remove elements from the DOM with the remove function. You just find it with the $ function and then say .remove. If you want to delete the contents of an element, you can use the .empty function. That will delete all the children of a node in the DOM. So for example, I can use $image to find all of the image tags in my document and then call .remove to remove them. So this example will delete all of the images from a web page. I can also navigate the DOM. This is pretty easy to do just using the CSS selectors. If I'm really careful with my CSS selectors, I can get to pretty much anything in the page. But there are other ways to do it, and one is to use these functions. So the .children function on an element will retrieve all of the element as a JQuery object array. The .parent function will give me the parent object. .find and another CSS selector will give me all of the descendants of this node that match a particular selector. So for example, I could find all my paragraphs and then use .find to find all of the bold elements within my paragraph. Or I could search, I could find bracket I bracket, and it would find all of the italic tags within my paragraph. .prev returns the previous sibling of an element, the sibling that's right in front of it. .next retrieves the next sibling of an element, the sibling that's right after it in the DOM tree. You can also use the .filter function and a selector to take a selected list and throw away all of them except ones that also match this other selector, so it combines two selectors. We talked about some other ways to do that just using the CSS rules, and so you could do that in two different ways now. You can either do it with the CSS selector itself, or you can use .filter on an element to change the array that you get back. jQuery also makes it really easy to bind events to functions. Instead of having to do a lot of JavaScript code or change the HTML to add an onClick attribute, we can do that directly in the JavaScript using jQuery. So here's an example of some code. I've created a variable named clicks, which I set to 0. And I have a button on my web page. And every time they click the button, I want to count how many times the button's been clicked and update a paragraph to contain that number. So I'm using the jQuery function to find the button with ID myButton. And then I say .click. And the .click function registers an event handler. Whenever somebody clicks the button, it's going to call this function. And I've put an anonymous JavaScript function here that does two things. First, it increments clicks. It adds 1 to clicks. So clicks start at 0. The first time I click the button, clicks will become 1. The next time I click the button, clicks will become 2, and so forth. And then the second thing I did is I used jQuery to find the paragraph with ID set to counter. The sub-0 is a way to get the first element that matched the selector. And I'm changing its inner HTML to be clicks. Probably a better way to do this would have been to have used .prepend or .append. Then I wouldn't have needed the sub-0, and I wouldn't have needed the inner HTML. Let me show you what that would look like, actually, since we're here. I could just say .prepend clicks. And I don't want it to keep saying 1, 2, 3, 4. So before I do that, I would say .children .remove. So that'll remove all of the children of the counter paragraph, and then it will prepend a new child, the number of clicks. So what does this look like? It looks like this. I've got my button. I've got my paragraph that says you have clicked, in this case, 5 times. 5 is in a paragraph with ID set to counter. And every time I click, it's going to add 1 to the counter. So in addition to the click function, I can also have other events that I handle. I can handle a double click with the DBL click function. I can handle a mouse enter and a mouse leave event. There's actually also a .hover function that takes 2 functions, and one for mouse entering, one for mouse leaving. I prefer to use mouse enter and mouse leave separately, but you can try out hover if you want to. jQuery also gives us some really nice animations. These are actually called jQuery effects, but I've called them jQuery actions in this slide. But if you Google for jQuery effects, you'll find a lot of these functions and more information about them. I can hide an element by saying .hide. I can show it again by saying .show. If I want to show it if it's hidden or hide it if it's shown, I can use the toggle function. So for example, I can find my button, and I can set its .click event to do this code. The function searches for a paragraph with ID text, and it toggles it. So when I click the button, It'll find the text paragraph, and if it's visible, it'll hide it. And if it's invisible, it'll show it again. So clicking the button will make the paragraph appear and disappear. So here's my paragraph. It says, this is some boring text, make it go away. And there's a button that says, click me. And when you do click on the button, we call toggle, and that makes the text go away. If we click on it again, the text will reappear. Some of the other animations are the fade in animation, which does the same thing as show, basically, except that it's slower, and it just makes it fade in. The nice thing about these functions is that they can take a delay, basically a number of seconds, or actually it's milliseconds, a number of milliseconds for the effect to take effect. And so I can tell it fade in over the course of 1,000 milliseconds. So I could say dot fade in of 1,000, and it would take a second, one full second, for the element to fade back in. I can use fade out to hide something again slowly. And there's also fade toggle, which will fade it in or fade it out, depending on whether it's visible or not. So for example, I can take my button and give it a click function that says, find that text paragraph and fade it out slowly. In addition to a number of milliseconds, I can use the keywords fast and slow as strings. Some of the other animations that are available are slide down and slide up. These don't slide things onto the page from the top of the page or the side or anything like that. What they do is they basically hide and unhide things by expanding them and then shrinking them until they disappear. So slide down basically unfolds an element as if it were folded up and shows it like by sliding it down. And then slide up hides it again by sliding it back up. Similarly to fade, there's a slide toggle function that will show it if it's not shown and hide it if it's already shown. So JQuery is a wonderful library. I hope that you'll play around with it. It makes accessing the DOM much easier. It uses CSS selectors to choose an element or a set of elements, and it returns an array of objects that match that selector. JQuery extends JavaScript with a bunch of new features, including some neat animations. There's a whole lot more to JQuery than I can show you in one lecture. So I hope that you'll read more about it and try some of those ideas out for your glitter in the lab. Have a great week.